when you're working on the renovation of, like the whole of the Delhi Gate Bazaar Road has been restored with beautiful paving, the houses have been done up, but how does that actually work with regard to the residents there? How much do they contribute and how much do they benefit?
Well, this program has been conceived not as essentially a historic, the restoration of heritage. It's more focused upon improving the livelihood of the residents of the walled city. So that's the primary focus. In fact, 70% of our funds are under the ground. We can't even showcase it to anybody. But that's a more sustainable way. And I'm glad I wasn't there because I'm more into embellishments and decorative things, but some people saner than me had conceptualized it. And you'll be surprised to know that today, in that portion of the walled city that is from Delhi Gate onwards towards Wazir Khan Mosque, those mohallas have those facilities which even where we are sitting may not have those. Like the wires have been pulled down, the lamp posts have been removed, entirely a new sewerage has been laid, a new water system.
But you know, Lashari Sahab, what's extremely interesting is the Wazir Khan Hammam project.
Yeah.
And I'd like to ask Masood Ahmed Khan Sahab about actually the hammam itself, because personally I have a bit of a contention with it. It's a fantastic project, but at the same time it's not. And let me qualify that by saying that whilst it's a massive step forward to actually have a project executed in the manner it's been executed, the spatial experience of actually coming into the hammam is something that I find problematic, because the original experience was you're sitting in the hawse and you're looking up at the ceiling. Now, with the very sensitive interventions you've done, you enter the building on these kind of shaky iron bridges, walkways, and you're actually forced to look down. How would you kind of negotiate that?
Well, first I think the underlying problem there is whether you are going to use the building, whether you're going to use the building as it was used originally or not. Buildings are functional things, they're utilitarian objects. And it's quite natural to conceive of conserving them and putting them to the use that they once were used for. But often you enter a historic building where things are set up like a museum. And there are countless examples across the world of historic buildings where you set it up so that people can view it in a more objectified manner, in which history is objectified. Yes, the best examples of those are where you can actually sense in a more profound way and a less objective way how the buildings were used. Even as museums, you experience the buildings as they were used. So there's this dichotomy between putting history at a distance and looking at it more objectively, and experiencing history more intersubjectively. And in our case, it was simple because we needed to first of all explore for the people of Lahore what this building really was. And so we carried out an extensive amount of excavations and rediscovered how the building worked. Not that such buildings do not exist elsewhere in the world. This building is an example of countless living hammams in Iran and some in Turkey. It's almost a replica of the Hammam in Kirman and so on. But the people of Lahore have long forgotten the tradition of using a public bathhouse. And we could not conceive of recreating a public bathhouse because that tradition has left us. So I don't know whether you, I don't want to take too much of your time.
I believe that, you know, Shahi Hammam is a very valuable example because conservation has been terribly misused, the word and the practice of conservation. I would beg archaeology, let the ruins be as they are, please don't restore them the way they restore it, you know. It's like putting ugly makeup on a beautiful woman. They've destroyed the character of the buildings in the past, and and this is an example where, as a textbook example, where you see technical work done in conservation in an appropriate manner. Everything is not repaired and made new. You see some of the parts incomplete, you see some of the crafts areas without being touched, you see areas which are restored. So you see the whole process. This awareness is very important because archaeology in the past has been destroying monuments by doing cheap and bad conservation. So we say, please leave them, I would say, leave them in ruins, don't restore them if this is restoration. So it has to be checked, like in Wazir Khan you find patches. That restoration is not you make a building new as it was made yesterday. It has to carry the spirit of the age and that sensitivity. For that awareness in the people, Shahi Hammam is an example to be seen as to how this craft of conservation is correctly applied to monuments.
And wondering now, what do we decide to preserve? How do we decide that we would like to conserve X and not Z? Would you take that on, Lucy?
I think where you have an area where it's a very typical, complete example of a certain period, then it probably does make more sense to concentrate on that area, like where we went yesterday in Gawalmandi with a lot of houses and very few more recent interventions. So, and the same thing with the old city. There are certain areas where, in the old walled city, there are certain areas where there's a greater density of really exceptional buildings. But I think effectively in the walled city, if it can all be preserved as it is with this current street layout and still become attractive. And the problem is when people actually don't want to live and use the buildings, what do you do then? And I think in both those areas there is an issue, and the kind of people who can afford to live in those, well, who live in those houses cannot afford to maintain them in the way that they will preserve them. And that is obviously where some help from organisations like the Walled City Authority can help. But
what would you say, Masood Sahab? What do we wish to preserve and why do we preserve it?
Well, it's all a question of values. We like to preserve things that are of higher value to us as heritage and as heritage and as things we value. There's a scale at which you can look at these things. You have a family heirlooms, for instance, that you value and you preserve them, protect them. Then, of course, there's heritage that grows, from a family to a national or international heritage. When you take a single building and you analyze it, you find it layered with its history. And unlayering that history and to establish what is of higher value and what is not of higher value is an important aspect of conservation work. Yet you do not want, as far as possible, to erase the mark that history has left on the building. So it's the way you juggle between these values that and you establish a sequence of priorities and a hierarchy of values that enable you to define and identify those things that you want to conserve.
Because I find the examples of the Reichstag and the Neue Museum in Berlin quite interesting, where the Germans aren't entirely fond of recalling World War II, but bullet holes, scars, graffiti have all actually been preserved. So here's a nation actively wanting to forget something by remembering it. How does that work?
I think these are more advanced notions of recalling and appreciating history. If you talk to an ordinary German, and you talk conversationally as if you're having a cup of coffee with them, and you mention Palestine, and there's an immediate reaction to it, and there's a recoil as a taboo subject not to be conversed on. And I think that what Germany went through and what the world went through in the Second World War is trauma at a global scale, and to contain the mark of these traumas inside yourself and yet deal with it in some way would probably result in these complex, reactions, cultural reactions to heritage.
Yeah.
I was going to add that preserving some of the Hindu and Sikh heritage in this city is terribly important, because you have to remember that once it was a multicultural city and everybody rubbed along very nicely, and they still could.
Well,
across the border,
I wonder, because is it our heritage?
Of course it's
to ask a very provocative question.
Of course it's your heritage, because you've had people living, different communities living side by side for 1,000 years.
Absolutely. So then what is our responsibility to perhaps safeguard, conserve, or even preserve it? Is it the same as preserving a mosque? Is it the same as actually, something that we might hold dear and sacred to ourselves? What is the responsibility of a civilized society to actually preserve something that may not represent its ideal values, quote unquote?
I had this debate. I attended a group discussion with Faiz Saab, and we asked him, Kiji, hum Samarkand or Bukhara, we have come from there, and all these things here, Texala and Mohenjo-daro, we have nothing to do with it. He said, no, you can't say that. He says, why? He said, whatever is on this earth, this land where we live, belongs to us. So we have to preserve not only selfishly what belongs to our religion or our things, we have to preserve everything valuable and old. If it belongs to the others, it doesn't matter.
All the more important for the society that is it's shaping into, we must hold on to the values of coexistence, plurality, and living with other races or religions, which we have lost after the division of the subcontinent. Then we kept getting into divisions, what to live with others we can't today live with ourselves. So that's where we have reached to. So all the more important with such symbols of old times.
It's so interesting that there's this big fracas about Valentine's Day, until Dawn actually did a fabulous story about how actually we have a massive tradition of love and culture in Heer Ranjha or Sori Maiwal and all of that. So when do things perhaps start becoming alien to us? Do they have to come from another source?
Surely they came from another source. They are being superimposed. That's not what our culture is, what is now being dished out to us. They have taken and rooted out festivals like Basant, which grew from this land, centuries old. Not that it was superimposed or it was government's created function. It was from the people of this gully mohallas. And you look at, dance and music is a questionable thing today in Pakistan. What you look at is kikli, dalna, ye jhumar, luddi, tappe, maiye, and all those love stories that you're talking about. I can't think of those many in another. I think we are very romantic people if you come to think of it. And there have been great many Romeos here and Juliets here. But we are today trying to crush all that under I think we have to ultimately answer this question. Do we belong to this land of the subcontinent, or do we belong to Middle East, Saudi Arabia for that matter? So yes, religiously we all are attached to, and that is not only Saudi Arabia's religion, that is religion of 56 countries of the world. Every country has these Muslim countries, their own culture. There are ladies wearing skirts, there are ladies wearing burqas. Why? Because that's the culture. So the difference between religion and culture is getting now very blurred, and it's getting superimposed by those lands. You find.
But I'm kind of done with talking about what Lahore was. Perhaps aren't we all done with talking about what Lahore was? Can we talk about perhaps what Lahore is, through also preserving, through also through coexistence, actually, simply put. But then what are the steps, perhaps what are the seeds?
You see, if you look at, sometimes I try to analyze the culture of the walled city, which represent the old Lahore. How easy, relaxed, liberal people they are. We had Basants and all the fashionable people of Lahore, and ladies used to flock to the rooftops of the old city. Did we ever hear even one incident where somebody was harassed or there was any issue? No. So that's what real Lahore is. They're open-hearted, they're open-minded, and that is more truly represented by those people there in those gully mohallas, where there are no doors, there are no walls, and it's open, men, women, everybody, and all kinds of. But so this culture is not ours, which is seeping into us and sort of sweeping over.
So when we look at something like the picture wall at the Lahore Fort, which I believe you're restoring as well.
No, right now we are undertaking a very careful documentation of the picture wall and analysis of the decay and the degradation it has suffered over the centuries. But we hope to, in the next phase, given funding, which we are expecting, to take up the conservation of the picture wall also, as being one of the things that probably the main reason why the Lahore Fort is on the World Heritage List.
So what makes the picture wall special? And given the values and changing values that we've been talking about, does the picture wall gain any special significance?
Well, the picture wall has layers of significance. I could begin by the mound that was the Lahore Fort before the Mughals took it up. It was a mound that sloped towards the river, which flowed just adjacent to where the fort is now. And the picture wall is essentially an apron wall that was created to fortify the royal presence, as well as a means of an interface between human occupancy and the river itself, the nature that flowed next to it. But that is an intrinsic ontological feature of the picture wall. But obviously there's also an obverse of it where you actually gaze at the picture wall and take in what it represents in all those images. And but before that, one also has to, there's some basic statistics involved. It's probably the largest mosaic mural in the world. And not only that, it is representative of a huge number of aspects of Mughal court life that you find written about in the historical narrative that are there for you to look at and reflect upon. It is also the largest example of tradition of tile making, of glazed tile making, that was centered around these parts of the subcontinent for a very brief period in history, probably 150 years before it came and went. So overall, and many more reasons, it's a very interesting object, the picture wall. There are palaces built into it, deep into it, that are hidden behind the picture wall. Of course, there are palaces that you and I go and see normally, like the Sheesh Mahal and all. But below the Sheesh Mahal is a summer palace, which is a huge structure.
And the interesting thing about it is that it must reflect the amount that the river was used. The riverfront must have been used a lot, and presumably when the river, in the monsoon, when the river was full, people were in boats. There was this backdrop of the fort and the picture wall from their boats.
Yeah.
So when cultures change, values change, doesn't the architecture follow? And so then why preserve? Why? I'm still confused, you know.
Well, I mean, if you go into defense, then the architecture is very different from in the walled city. But I think people actually are quite interested in, well, many people are interested in how their ancestors lived, and the problem is there's an element of worshipping the picturesque, which is problematic when it's, this is interfering with people's lives, and when people are living in houses that are threatened by conservation and gentrification. So there are a lot of aspects of preserving old areas of cities that have to be very carefully thought about. But I think most people actually, when they're physically inside these cities and there's a nice smooth road to walk on, they can look around while they're walking, they enjoy it. And they like going to places, these sort of places for shopping. They like going for their...
I think Naif Sahib has something he'd like to add.
Need preservation in spirit. Buildings listed to be preserved is one job to be done. It's job of archaeology and other preservation. But we have squares and chalks like Lakshmi Chalk. If we are getting a train in the center of it, then we are not preserving our squares and chalks. It's not literal preservation of one building or two buildings that matters. It is the spirit of a city that can be preserved in its modern architecture.
Now, this is something interesting, the spirit of a city embodying itself in modern architecture. How would that work?
It's a tough job. It hasn't been done, but it should be done.
But what about Gaddafi and Alhambra right next door? In my mind, that's actually one of the most striking buildings, not just in Lahore, but actually in Pakistan and perhaps even the world. It's just undervalued perhaps because of the state it's in, but it was an accidental work. Okay. So how does modernity actually work when things are becoming more conservative? Do we...
Well, I think there is this notion that conservation or being conservative, they're two different things. I think you're referring to conservation. So conservation is a modern sensibility. And I think conservation became the de rigueur thing as modernity, modern ways of looking at the past came about after the 16th century in Europe and spread around the world. So being modern is not, it's not, in my opinion, it does not conflict with conservation. Conservation is actually a part of being modern.
Were the Mughals modern, do you think?
I don't think so. I think they were beginning to interface with modernity, just as it was evolving in Europe.
India, they were ultra-modern.
Yeah. So going back to your point, conservation is a way of setting yourself both outside of and within your history. And the two things work in tandem, it's intersubjective. It's not just me and you, but us together, kind of a notion. And when you're in a historic building and you reflect on it, you often struck with wonder and awe. And it is the objectification of that wonder and awe is what conservation is all about.
I had a look at the OED yesterday just to check on this word heritage, and I noticed that its use in the way we use it now for our architectural heritage or heritage trails, heritage this, heritage that, came in only a few decades ago. Before that, what it meant was the heritage that you got from your ancestors and you were going to be passing on to your descendants. And that was to do much more with property and goods. But obviously, it applies equally to our cultural heritage that we do get from our ancestors, and some of that is in the form of buildings. And so I do think we have a responsibility to pass that on to our descendants.
If I may ask Nair Saab and Kamran Saab to add their closing comments.
You see, I believe we have a very muddled history, very hazy, very conflicting, and very, what shall one say, fragmented history. In many ways, I find that we are lost souls, and now how to identify ourselves with, sometimes we do it with, as we just mentioned, Saudi Arabia, sometimes we become part of the Indian subcontinent, no matter even if we don't want to, but our Mehdis, our songs and everything, films, etc. And then Central Asia, Persian. It's very important that we must find our soul. And our children, our generations must understand who they are and where do they anchor themselves with. And how do they get rooted in with this soil, because we are not like the German race, we are not like even the Persian Empire or something. So our history, where does it begin, where does it go through? And I've seen very educated people, when we were doing this Tollington Market restoration, my own chief secretary at that time and many secretaries, they said, we are not going to forgive you for this. What is there to preserve about this? This is already now derelict, broken. This was lying for 13 years, staring in the face of everybody to do something about it. And yet, when something was being done, many people in position were not happy. I walked up to one general who was heading the Evacu Trust properties, and I said, sir, there are many buildings in the Mall Road. We are trying to restore those. And I learned that the many buildings belong to the Evacu Trust. Could you please, this is our common heritage. So I made my narrative, and he looks at me and he says, so you really think this is our common heritage? So I just felt like walking out. Now this itself, till today, is not to talk about the common man on the street. Very educated, established people do not relate themselves with the Mughal times or with the, and look at it, what in India right now, let's say it's a Hindu state, but they have restored the Humayun's tomb and many other tombs. The Aghan Trust has done that job in India. So if they can own up and affiliate and still continue to hold on to relics of the past of the Mughal times with the Muslims, why do we have a problem? I have no idea. But unless we learn to do that, I think till our past is clear and solid, our future will always remain very muddled.
Masood Sahib, would you like to add something?
Just go back to your question about the rattly walkways. No, Mom. First of all, when to begin with, they were not so rattly.
No, it's good they're rattly. They don't damage the actual building by screwing themselves in.
Yeah. So when we dug it up, we came across a whole lot of original plasterwork and underfloors that had remained buried for a long, long time, 200 years in the building. And so one of the first priority was to preserve and treasure those things so that we're not trampling upon them and repeat what had happened to the building in the past. So the whole idea of creating a walking surface in which people can actually experience the historicity of those uncovered things without touching them was a highly important aspect. You would also notice that there's not a single switch in the wall, not a single wire has been put in conduits in the wall. They're all strung under the walking surfaces. So the building is completely reversible. You can take away this walking area and the electrical connections and the lights, and it will appear to you as you found it. So these are aspects of conservation that are important.
I'm afraid we've run out of time. We can take one or two questions. Guys, if we can get a microphone there, please.
Thank you for taking my questions. Before it was restored, and wonderfully it's been restored. I got really offended of your question. Sorry, I do not know your name.
Do you have a question? If you don't have a question, I'm afraid.
No, but okay. One question. You offended the panel by saying that I'm not in.
Actually, I'm terribly sorry. We need a question if you have one.
What was the inspiration behind it, and how many more inspirations like that you have? And I would really like to know about that.
Thank you. Maybe there's a lady in the front, if we may.
Of course, you would know how best to handle that, because I find that the weather is really getting to it, and it would be a pity if it was to disappear. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Coexistence, it has been done in other places that development can take place without burying the signs of heritage. It's a sensitive and difficult job. It has been done elsewhere, and it should have been done here as well. They could coexist, but if you do not value heritage, then you bulldoze it and you don't bother. It is the fault of the consultancy, whoever has made decisions and made those plans. They could be amended, corrected and improved, where Lahore can could grow, could even modernize, and still preserve the valuable spots of World Heritage.
And on that note, we come to an end on this session. Thank you for coming to the revised LLF, and hope to see you next year as well. Thank you.